The venue was quiet, not the kind of quiet that feels empty but the kind that feels important. It wasn't Hollywood. There were no flashing cameras, no red carpets, no screaming fans. Just a global leadership forum focused on youth, responsibility, and the future. Keanu Reeves sat near the middle row, dressed simply as always, dark jacket, minimal presence, almost blending in. Despite decades of global fame, he had never been drawn to spectacle. He preferred listening over speaking, observing over performing. He had attended events like this before. He had heard world leaders, tech billionaires, humanitarian icons, all delivering carefully polished speeches about change. But this felt different. Across the stage stood Ibrahim Traoré, young, composed, steady. There was no grand introduction, no dramatic music. Just a calm walk to the podium. No teleprompter glare in his eyes. No theatrical gestures. Just presence. Keanu leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. Something about Traoré's stillness commanded attention without demanding it. The room gradually settled into complete silence. When Traoré began speaking, his voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, grounded, controlled. He spoke not like a politician trying to persuade, but like a man carrying responsibility. He spoke about burden, about expectations placed on young shoulders, about leadership not being a privilege, but a weight. Keanu's expression shifted subtly. This wasn't rehearsed charisma. This wasn't emotional manipulation. There was no attempt to impress the audience. There was conviction. Every sentence felt lived, not written. The air in the room changed. You could feel it. And for the first time that evening, Keanu wasn't just listening politely. He was listening personally. He didn't know it yet, but the words that were about to follow would hit deeper than any speech he had heard in decades. Because sometimes the most powerful moments don't come from spectacle. They come from sincerity. And this was only the beginning. The silence in the hall wasn't forced. It settled naturally. Ibrahim Traoré stood steady at the podium, shoulders relaxed, eyes forward. There was no dramatic pacing, no raised fists, no attempt to stir applause. His presence alone held the room. I was not prepared for leadership, he began evenly. No one truly is. But when responsibility calls, comfort is no longer an option. The words were simple. But they didn't feel rehearsed. They felt earned. Across the audience, people shifted in their seats. Not out of boredom, but because something in his tone demanded internal reflection. Keanu Reeves leaned forward slightly, his hands loosely clasped. He had heard thousands of speeches over the years, from film sets to humanitarian galas to global conferences. He had mastered the art of respectful listening. But this was different. Traoré spoke about pressure. Not the pressure of headlines, but the pressure of knowing that every decision could affect millions of lives. He spoke about waking up before sunrise, not because of ambition, but because the weight of responsibility refused to let him sleep. He spoke about sacrifice. Leadership, he said calmly, is not about power. It is about restraint. It is about choosing what is right when it costs you personally. The room grew even quieter. No one checked their phones. No one whispered. The atmosphere had shifted from formal to intimate. Traoré described moments of doubt. Moments when criticism was loud, when expectations felt impossible, when the burden felt isolating. But you do not step forward because you are fearless, he continued. You step forward because fear cannot decide for you. Keanu's expression softened. Those words didn't sound political. They sounded human. Traoré wasn't selling inspiration. He was describing endurance. He spoke about discipline over ego, purpose over popularity, long-term vision over short-term praise. Comfort, he said, pausing briefly, is often the enemy of responsibility. That line lingered in the air. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady. The kind of statement that forces you to examine your own life without anyone pointing a finger. Keanu exhaled slowly, almost unconsciously. For decades, he had navigated fame with humility. He had avoided excess, avoided scandal, avoided self-promotion. But even so, hearing responsibility framed this way struck something deeper. Traoré continued, his tone unwavering. When you are entrusted with influence, whether over a nation, a company, or even a single person, you must ask yourself, are you protecting others or protecting your comfort? That question landed heavily. The applause didn't come immediately. People weren't ready to clap. They were thinking. Keanu's eyes lowered briefly. Not out of sadness, but reflection. He had built a career admired by millions. He had carried personal losses quietly. He had endured pressure without complaint. But this message wasn't about survival. It was about accountability. And in that moment, the distance between a world leader and a Hollywood icon disappeared. It wasn't about titles. It wasn't about fame. It was about the universal weight of responsibility. Traore concluded this section of his speech with quiet conviction. You do not rise because you are exceptional. You rise because others are depending on you. This time, applause slowly filled the hall. Measured. Respectful. Earned. Keanu didn't clap right away. He remained still, absorbing every word. Because something had shifted. And the speech wasn't even over. The applause faded, but the weight of the words remained. Ibrahim Traoré stood still for a moment, scanning the audience, not with pride, not with expectation, but with focus. It wasn't the look of someone enjoying admiration. It was the look of someone measuring responsibility. When he spoke again, his voice softened slightly. Power, he said, is the most misunderstood word in leadership. The room leaned in. People think power means control over others. Control over resources. Control over decisions. But that is not power. That is position. He paused. True power is control over yourself. The statement settled like a stone in water, steady, expanding outward. Keanu Reeves felt the words hit differently this time. His posture changed subtly. His back straightened. His hands unclasped. His eyes fixed more intensely on the stage. Traore continued. If anger controls you, you are weak. If ego controls you, you are vulnerable. If comfort controls you, you are replaceable. No raised voice. No dramatic emphasis. Just certainty. He spoke about discipline, not as punishment but as protection. Protection from corruption. Protection from pride. Protection from losing sight of why you began. Leadership, he said calmly, is lonely not because people abandon you, but because you must abandon certain parts of yourself. The room grew impossibly quiet. Even the faint hum of air conditioning seemed distant. Traore described the weight of making decisions that may not be popular but are necessary. Of choosing long-term stability over short-term applause. Of standing firm when critics misunderstand your silence. You must be willing, he said, to be misunderstood today so that your people can be secure tomorrow. Keanu's jaw tightened slightly. He knew what it meant to be misunderstood. To be seen as quiet, distant, reserved, when in reality depth often requires silence. He had lived much of his life avoiding spectacle, choosing privacy over noise. But this was different. This wasn't about public image. It was about moral endurance. Traore shifted his gaze across the hall. If your character changes when you gain influence, he continued, then you were never prepared for influence. That line struck deep. Not because it was accusatory, but because it was absolute. There was no wiggle room in it. No comfort in it. Only truth. Keanu's eyes lowered briefly. Not in discomfort, but in recognition. Traore spoke now about legacy. Legacy is not what they write about you, he said. Legacy is what remains standing when you are no longer in the room. The audience absorbed that quietly. He spoke of young generations watching closely. Of the silent observers who measure actions more than words. Of children who inherit not just nations, but examples. You do not lead for today's applause, he said firmly. You lead for tomorrow's stability. Something in the tone shifted, not louder, not harsher, but deeper. This wasn't ambition speaking. This was conviction. Keanu felt a tightening in his chest he couldn't immediately explain. The words weren't theatrical. They weren't emotionally manipulative. They were steady. And steady truths often hit harder than emotional speeches. Traore concluded this portion with a final reflection. When history tests you, it will not ask how powerful you were. It will ask how disciplined you remained. This time there was no immediate applause. Only stillness. The kind of stillness that happens when a room full of accomplished people realizes they are being measured by a higher standard. Keanu remained motionless. Because he wasn't just listening anymore. He was evaluating himself. And the speech was building towards something even more personal. The room remained still, but the tension was palpable. Every attendee, from journalists to young leaders, leaned forward in their seats. Even the sound of a pen scratching on paper seemed intrusive. This wasn't a performance. It wasn't an awards show. It was a moment of truth. Ibrahim Traoré paused, his gaze sweeping across the hall. He didn't need to speak loudly, his presence alone carried weight. If your success, he said slowly, does not protect the vulnerable, it is not success. It is comfort. The words landed like a sudden hush in a storm. For many, it was a strikingly straightforward statement. For Keanu Reeves, however, it was seismic. He had built a career in a world that often celebrated spectacle over substance. He had witnessed people seeking fame, recognition, applause, sometimes at the cost of ethics, sometimes at the cost of others. And yet here, in a quiet hall far from Hollywood, someone was articulating a principle that resonated far deeper than anything he had heard in years. Keanu's expression shifted subtly. A shadow passed over his usually calm features. The line about protecting the vulnerable echoed in his mind. It wasn't just about leadership in a political sense. It was about integrity, responsibility, and moral courage. The words transcended the stage and struck at a personal level, a quiet reckoning. Traore continued, his tone unwavering yet gentle. Leadership is not measured by power, popularity, or influence. It is measured by the impact you leave on those who cannot defend themselves. By the choices you make when no one is watching. The audience held their breath. Some shifted in their seats, realizing they were not mere spectators, they were witnesses to a profound teaching. Others, including Keanu, felt the pull of introspection, the kind that refuses to be ignored. Keanu's mind wandered briefly to moments in his own life. Decisions made quietly, acts of kindness unseen, sacrifices that were never publicized. He had always valued humility and discretion, yet hearing it framed as a moral imperative from Traore's perspective felt illuminating. It made the invisible weight of responsibility visible. Traore leaned slightly forward, emphasizing his next point. You will be misunderstood. You will be criticized. You will face loneliness in your decisions. But if your actions protect those who cannot protect themselves, you will have lived correctly. The words were not accusatory. They were not manipulative. They were precise. They cut to the core of human purpose. Keanu's breath caught ever so slightly. The quiet dignity of Traore's message, the raw authenticity of it, broke through the barriers that fame and experience had built around him. This wasn't about public image, awards, or recognition. This was about truth, integrity, and moral courage, things he had sought to uphold privately for decades, now articulated in a way that crystallized their meaning. A subtle emotion began to form in him, something Keanu rarely displayed publicly. It wasn't sadness nor was it joy. It was reverence. A recognition that the world's most profound lessons often come from authenticity, not spectacle. Traore's voice softened, carrying the weight of lived experience. History will judge you not by the applause you receive, but by the lives you uplift and the responsibilities you honor. Your legacy is written not in headlines, but in the well-being of those you serve. Keanu's eyes glistened, and for a moment, he was entirely unguarded. Those in the room who knew him only as a composed figure of Hollywood watched as something rare unfolded. A public figure touched deeply by sincerity, wisdom, and moral clarity. For several heartbeats there was silence. Not the awkward pause of a speech concluding, but a collective stillness of reflection. Traore had delivered more than a speech. He had delivered a mirror for everyone in that room, asking them to confront their own values, their own decisions, and their own responsibility. Keanu exhaled slowly, shoulders relaxing, yet his posture remained dignified. He wasn't moved by rhetoric. He wasn't moved by charisma. He was moved by truth. And in that moment he realized that the words he had just heard would stay with him forever, not as a lesson for the public but as a compass for life, career, and legacy. The room remained hushed, the weight of insight lingering long after the speech had ended. This was a turning point not just for Keanu Reeves but for everyone present. A reminder that true influence comes not from applause, fame, or position, but from accountability, integrity, and the courage to protect and serve, even when no one is watching. The formal part of the event concluded, but the air remained charged with the gravity of what had just been said. Most of the attendees were slowly dispersing, discussing the speech in hushed tones. Some took notes. Others whispered reflections to one another. But for Keanu Reeves, the edge of the hall, his eyes tracking Ibrahim Traoré as he descended from the stage. Traoré moved calmly through the crowd, exchanging brief nods with attendees but remaining focused, almost magnetic in his quiet authority. There was no fanfare, no entourage, only purpose and presence. Keanu approached him quietly, careful not to draw attention. This wasn't about headlines or public appearances. It was personal. The words Traoré had spoken had struck something deep within him, a chord he didn't even realize had been waiting to resonate. When Keanu finally reached him, Traoré turned with a small, respectful nod. "Mr. Reeves," he said simply. No formality, no embellishment, just recognition of another human being. "Please," Keanu said softly, "call me Keanu." His voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it, a subtle acknowledgement of vulnerability. I've heard countless speeches over the years, from leaders, thinkers, activists, but I've never heard anything like that tonight. Traore's expression remained composed, almost serene. Because I wasn't speaking to impress anyone, he replied. I was speaking to remind myself. Every day I have to remember why I stand where I stand, and why I make the decisions I make. Keanu nodded slowly, absorbing the words. He understood immediately. It wasn't performance. It wasn't rhetoric. It was lived experience distilled into words, clear, uncompromising, and human. They walked a short distance to a quiet corner of the venue, away from cameras and spectators. For a man like Keanu, who had spent decades under the public eye, this privacy was rare. Here there was no role to play, no expectation to entertain, no obligation to perform. Only two individuals connecting over purpose, experience, and reflection. Keanu's gaze softened. It's unusual for me to feel this kind of weight from a speech, he said, his tone revealing vulnerability he rarely showed publicly. I've seen power, fame, and influence in all its forms. I've met people who lead, people who inspire, people who take advantage of their position. But tonight, it felt different. Authentic. Immediate. Real. Traore nodded. Authenticity is the only thing that endures. Titles fade. Recognition fades. But what you do, what you protect, what you live by, that remains. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was contemplative, reflective, a shared understanding that transcended titles, fame, or status. They were two humans standing face to face, absorbing the gravity of responsibility. Keanu finally spoke again, quieter this time. I think I've spent so long trying to live humbly, trying not to draw attention, that I sometimes forget the weight of the responsibility I do carry, even in small ways. But hearing you frame it like this, it's a reminder that responsibility isn't about recognition. It's about accountability. Traore smiled faintly. Exactly. It's not about how many people know your name. It's about how many lives are touched by the choices you make, and the ones you choose to protect without reward or applause. Keanu exhaled, a mixture of relief and awe. For decades he had managed grief, fame, and pressure with a quiet dignity. But tonight something had shifted. The speech, followed by this personal conversation, had pierced through layers of public persona and self-protection. It had connected with the essence of who he was and who he aspired to be. I needed to hear that, Keanu said softly, almost to himself. I needed to hear it not as advice, not as critique, but as truth. Traore's eyes were steady. Truth has a way of finding you when you are ready to listen. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It waits for understanding. Keanu nodded, a rare moment of emotion flickering across his face. Subtle, restrained, but undeniable. This was more than inspiration. It was a mirror reflecting purpose, accountability, and integrity back to him. For a few minutes, they continued quietly, speaking about responsibility, legacy, and the quiet challenges of influencing others. No cameras. No applause. Just two individuals exploring the weight of influence, the cost of decisions, and the rare courage it takes to act with integrity. And in that private conversation, Keanu Reeves was no longer just a global icon. He was simply human, absorbing wisdom, reflecting, and acknowledging that even someone with decades of experience can still be profoundly moved by sincerity, authenticity, and truth. The formalities had ended and the crowd was slowly dispersing, yet Keanu Reeves remained rooted in place. The weight of what he had just heard, first in Traore's speech and then in their private conversation, pressed gently but insistently on his mind. Normally composed, the Hollywood icon now found himself grappling with emotions he rarely allowed to surface in public. He leaned against a wall, arms folded loosely, head bowed slightly, eyes distant. For decades, he had been trained to navigate fame with a quiet dignity. Cameras, expectations, applause, they rarely unsettled him. But tonight was different. This was not performance, not applause-driven inspiration. It was truth. Real, undeniable human truth that cut through layers of pretense and habit. Keanu, Traore had said earlier, truth has a way of finding you when you are ready to listen. Now, Keanu understood exactly what he meant. It was as if each word he had heard reverberated inside him, exposing corners of vulnerability he had long kept private. The quiet griefs, the moments of self-doubt, the personal sacrifices. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, breathing deeply. The exhaustion of long-held composure collided with a rush of humility and reflection. Tears, not dramatic, not theatrical, threatened at the edges of his eyes. He did not wipe them away immediately. He did not attempt to hide the weight settling in his chest. This was authenticity, rare and unguarded. Traore approached again, noticing the subtle shift. He did not speak loudly or impose but simply stood nearby, present, steady, attentive. He understood instinctively that some lessons are not taught with words, but absorbed in silence. Sometimes, the mere acknowledgement of another human being's gravity is enough. Keanu exhaled slowly. "I've carried so much quietly for so long," he said softly, almost to himself. "Loss, responsibility, the pressure to do what's right without anyone noticing. But hearing you tonight, feeling your words, it's like, I don't know, a confirmation of everything I've tried to live by." Traore nodded subtly. "It is often easier to act than to understand the meaning of those actions," he replied calmly. "Most people only see results. Few understand the weight of each decision behind them. That is the challenge and the honor of responsibility." The emotional shift in Keanu was gradual but unmistakable. The stoic exterior he had maintained in public for decades softened. His shoulders dropped, his breath slowed, and a quiet tears welled up, not from weakness but from recognition. Recognition that someone, somewhere, had articulated a moral truth he had felt instinctively for years but had never quite heard voiced so clearly. He spoke again, his voice low, deliberate. "It's rare to hear someone articulate responsibility so clearly. Not for applause, not for recognition. Just truth. I've never heard anything like that." Traore responded simply, "That is because truth does not require performance. It requires honesty, integrity, and the courage to carry weight others avoid." Keanu nodded, understanding in a visceral, almost physical way. His career, his private life, the silent acts of kindness, the humility in his decisions, all suddenly connected in a web of purpose and accountability. What had always been internalized now had context, framing, and validation. For a few moments, the two men stood together in quiet reflection, the world outside continuing, unaware of the emotional gravity unfolding in that corner of the room. This was not a spectacle. It was private, intimate, transformational. Keanu's composure returned slowly, but with a softness that hadn't been there before. He was still Keanu Reeves, the icon, the actor, the global figure. But tonight, he was also a man deeply moved, consciously reflecting on legacy, responsibility, and the moral imperatives that guide one's life. In this rare, unguarded moment, it became clear. Even those who seem untouchable, serene, or invulnerable can be profoundly affected by authenticity, wisdom, and the courage to speak truth. For Keanu Reeves, this evening had shifted something fundamental. A quiet emotional reckoning that would shape his perspective far beyond the event, far beyond the public eye, into the core of his personal and moral compass. The hall was emptying. Attendees whispered to one another, some still replaying Traore's speech in their minds, others sharing notes and reflections. The energy had shifted from casual observation to deep contemplation. Yet Keanu Reeves remained seated for a few moments, absorbing everything. His usual calm demeanor had softened into introspection, his mind racing with thoughts and emotions he rarely allowed to surface in public. This was more than a powerful speech or a private conversation. It was a mirror. A reflection of responsibility, of authenticity, and of the profound weight that comes with influence. Keanu understood that leadership, whether in politics, cinema, or life itself, was not measured by applause, recognition, or fame. It was measured by how one honored the vulnerable, protected the powerless, and acted with unwavering integrity, even when no one was watching. As he walked slowly toward the exit, he replayed Traore's words in his mind. True strength is not in control over others. It is in control over yourself. If your success does not protect the vulnerable, it is not success, it is comfort. Each phrase carried weight, challenging assumptions he had built over decades. It was a reminder that influence without accountability is hollow, and recognition without purpose is empty. Outside, cameras were gathering, but Keanu ignored them. There were no words to give, no carefully crafted statement to deliver. This was not about optics or headlines. It was about reflection. The lesson was internal, and it would guide his actions quietly, deliberately for years to come. He thought of his career, the choices he had made, and the paths he had avoided, opportunities to chase fame or wealth that he had declined in favor of discretion, humility, and personal integrity. He realized that what Traore had articulated was something he had felt instinctively, but never heard so clearly: the moral imperative behind every action, the ethical responsibility that accompanies influence, the courage required to do what is right even when no one is watching. Keanu's phone buzzed with messages, reminders of interviews, schedules, and obligations. He ignored them. Tonight, none of it mattered. What mattered was the weight of understanding, the resonance of a truth spoken so sincerely that it transcended context, culture, and status. For anyone watching, this may have seemed like just another encounter between a global celebrity and a political leader. But for Keanu, it was transformative. He had been reminded that no matter how much experience one has, or how much wisdom one thinks they possess, the world still holds moments capable of piercing the heart, moments that challenge perspective and awaken deeper purpose. The lasting impact of this evening was not just on him. It rippled through those present, the audience who listened with rapt attention, and the countless people who would hear about it later. It was a lesson in humility, responsibility, and the rare courage to speak truth. Keanu left quietly, not seeking acknowledgement. He did not need to explain the emotion he had felt. The experience had done its work silently, internally. And that was the most powerful lesson of all. Sometimes the most profound influence comes not from spectacle but from sincerity, not from applause but from truth, not from fame but from integrity. And in that realization, Keanu Reeves carried forward a renewed sense of purpose. The words of Ibrahim Traoré would echo in his decisions, his actions, and his quiet leadership. For those who witnessed it, the message was clear. Influence is meaningful only when it is exercised with awareness, accountability, and compassion. And that is the kind of impact that lasts long after the moment ends, far beyond the cameras, the headlines, or the applause.